The forest was quiet. Too quiet. The trees, ancient and wise, stood like silent sentinels, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Greg Harris, seasoned wildlife observer and Oregon native, had learned to trust these moments of stillness, knowing that something one was always nearby. But today, the silence felt heavier. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, seemed to vibrate with an urgency he couldn't quite explain. He was crouched near the edge of a clearing when he saw her. The doe, her coat matted with dirt and blood, limped into view, dragging her leg behind her. Her eyes, wide with fear and pain, scanned the forest, as if searching for something or someone who could help. Greg's breath caught in his throat. The doe's injury wasn't the worst he had seen, but the situation was dire. And then, as if summoned by her suffering, a small fawn emerged from the brush. Fragile, unsteady, it hobbled behind the doe, struggling to keep up with her faltering pace. Greg's heart raced as the realization hit him. The fawn was injured too. It could barely walk. The bond between mother and child was clear in their every movement. The doe was trying to protect her young, but the world around them was growing darker by the minute. He instinctively reached for his gear, but as he did, a strange thought crossed his mind. Was it his place to intervene? Could he, in good conscience, break the natural order and help these creatures? His instinct screamed yes, but his training said no. The forest held its breath, and so did Greg. Greg Harris wasn't always the man he was today. Years of trekking through the wilds of Oregon, studying the delicate ecosystems and the creatures that called them home, had shaped him into a patient observer. But even now, after decades of experience, he often found himself in awe of the vast complexity of nature. Greg was a quiet man, someone who preferred the company of trees and rivers to crowded rooms or noisy gatherings. He had moved to Oregon over 20 years ago, drawn by the promise of unspoiled wilderness. His passion for wildlife had started as a child, watching documentaries and reading books about the interconnectedness of life. But it wasn't until he set foot on the mossy trails of the Pacific Northwest that he truly understood what those words meant. He spent his days cataloging animal populations, studying their habits, and observing how every species, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, played a crucial role in maintaining the balance of life. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful. Greg had seen the forest at its most beautiful and its most brutal. He had witnessed the triumphs of survival, the delicate dance between predator and prey, and the tragedies too. But it wasn't just the animals that fascinated him. It was the way they interacted with their environment, the quiet ways in which they communicated their needs, their fears, and their desires. Greg had come to understand that nature wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, full of stories waiting to be told. And for Greg, telling those stories became his mission. Yet, despite his wealth of knowledge, there were moments when the mysteries of the natural world still overwhelmed him. Today, standing on the edge of the clearing, watching the doe and her fawn, he felt a pang of uncertainty. This wasn't a situation he could simply observe. It was personal. The bond between mother and child was something every living creature could relate to. And Greg knew, deep down, that today would be different. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of the story. The doe limped forward, her movements slow and labored. Each step she took was a struggle, her injured leg dragging behind her. Yet, there was something in the way she held her head high-proud, defiant, as if she refused to let her pain show. She moved with the grace of a creature that knew her place in the world, and yet there was a vulnerability in her that tugged at Greg's heart. Greg remained motionless, crouching low in the brush, his eyes locked on the doe. He knew better than to approach too quickly. In his years of observing wildlife, he had learned that the slightest disturbance could send an animal fleeing into the depths of the forest. But the doe didn't run. Instead, she seemed to draw closer, her eyes never leaving him. There was an intelligence in her gaze, a silent plea that he could feel deep in his chest. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. Greg's mind raced. Was she looking for help? Was this an animal that had lost her instinct for survival? Or was she seeking someone to help her and her young? As the doe reached the edge of the clearing, the fawn hobbled into view, its legs shaky and uncertain. The tiny creature stumbled, tripping over a root before righting itself and continuing its path. Greg's heart broke. The fawn's eyes, wide with fear and confusion, flickered toward the doe, who looked back at it with such tenderness that Greg could feel the weight of their bond. It was clear that the doe wasn't just walking for herself. She was leading her fawn, guiding it through a world that had become dangerous and unpredictable. The small, injured fawn followed her without question, trusting that its mother would show the way, even if she too was struggling. The silence around Greg was deafening. The forest, usually so alive with the sounds of birds and insects, had fallen still. Every breath he took felt louder than the last. And yet, the doe's presence was undeniable. She wasn't just an animal in need, she was a mother protecting her child, desperate for a way to ensure their survival. Greg's chest tightened. The decision was upon him, and he knew it. Greg's heart pounded as he watched the doe and her fawn inch closer. The world around him seemed to blur, the air thick with the weight of the moment. He could feel the tension in his chest, a deep, gnawing uncertainty that refused to let go. His training, his years of experience told him to stay back, to observe from a distance, and let nature run its course. But his instincts, the part of him that had come to understand the language of the wild, were telling him something different. The doe, her eyes locked on Greg's, had come too close to be ignored. She wasn't retreating into the shadows like most animals would. No, she was standing her ground, and it was as if she were asking him a question without words. "Will you help me?" Greg's thoughts swirled. He had spent his career learning to respect the boundaries of nature, to never intervene, to never disrupt the delicate balance. The wilderness had its own rhythm, its own rules, and Greg had always believed in those rules. But what if the rules no longer made sense in this situation? What if nature needed a hand just this once? His gaze shifted from the doe to the fawn, who was trembling now, its legs barely able to support its fragile body. It wasn't just injured, it was vulnerable, helpless in a world that could be both brutal and beautiful. Every instinct in Greg screamed to act, to save the fawn, to ease the doe's pain. But what if he was wrong? What if by intervening he would upset the balance? He knew better than anyone that the natural world didn't follow human logic. What if this was just part of the circle of life? What if by stepping in, he was taking away the very thing that made life meaningful, the struggle, the survival, the lesson in every challenge? Greg exhaled slowly, his mind wrestling with the conflict. He couldn't bear the thought of standing idly by, watching them suffer. And yet, to act felt like a betrayal of everything he had spent his life observing. The two creatures before him, so fragile, so alive, were asking him to make a choice. Would he break his own rules? Would he act? Greg stood frozen, torn between his instincts and his training. The doe's gaze held him captive, a silent, pleading message that seemed to reverberate in the very air around him. He could feel the weight of her stare in his bones, the unspoken plea that tugged at his heart. The fawn, barely able to stand, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. It was as if the little creature believed that Greg could make everything right again, that he could fix what was broken. But could he? Was it even his place to try? The forest was still, too still. The wind had quieted, as if the trees themselves were waiting for Greg's decision. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds dragging into what felt like eternity. The usual hum of the woods, the rustling leaves, the chirping birdshad disappeared, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed down on him. He had always prided himself on knowing the forest, on understanding its rhythms, its ebbs and flows. But today was different. Today, the rules he had followed for so long felt irrelevant, out of place in the face of such raw, vulnerable need. Greg glanced at the fawn again. It was struggling to stay upright, its tiny body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The doe, though still standing strong, was limping with each step, her movements slow and deliberate. She was pushing through her own pain for the sake of her child, not giving up, not surrendering to the inevitable. Greg's breath hitched. In that moment, he understood. This wasn't just a lesson in nature, it was a lesson in compassion. The world wasn't always fair. Survival wasn't always guaranteed. But what mattered, what truly mattered, was the willingness to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. With a deep, steadying breath, Greg made his choice. He couldn't turn away. He couldn't watch these animals suffer when he had the means to help. His heart told him that there was more to this than simply observing. This was a moment to act, a moment to do what felt right, even if it went against everything he had learned. Greg slowly stood up, careful not to make any sudden movements. The doe's eyes followed him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of recognition, perhaps even gratitude there. She knew he had made his decision, just as he had. Moving with deliberate calm, Greg approached the fawn first, his hand steady as he gently lifted the fragile creature into his arms. The fawn's small, warm body pressed against him, and in that moment, Greg felt a deep connection that transcended species, a shared bond of trust. Then, turning his attention to the doe, Greg carefully examined her injury. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was severe enough to make walking difficult. His heart broke for her as he considered the pain she must be enduring. The forest had fallen silent, the animals holding their breath as if waiting for Greg to do what he had to do. He wasn't sure how this story would end, but one thing was clear. He couldn't stand by and watch. He was going to help, no matter the cost. The fawn's tiny body trembled in Greg's arms as he cradled it against his chest, its fragile ribs rising and falling with each labored breath. Greg could feel the heat of its fever seeping through its fur, and a deep sense of urgency welled up inside him. He had acted quickly, but now the real struggle had begun. He gently laid the fawn on the ground beside him, his hands moving swiftly but carefully as he checked for signs of serious injury. There was no obvious wound, no gaping cut or puncture that would explain its weakened state. Instead, it seemed to be suffering from a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and shock. Its eyes flickered as it struggled to remain conscious, the small body shuddering with each shallow breath. Greg worked quickly, his mind racing through the steps he had learned in his years of wildlife observation. He knew what needed to be done: stabilize the fawn, bring its temperature down, and provide the nutrition it needed to regain strength. But it wasn't going to be easy. The fawn was barely responsive, its body too weak to fight off the effects of the trauma it had endured. The doe, still standing nearby, watched Greg closely. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and trust, as though she knew he was trying to help but also feared for her baby. She remained close, only a few feet away, her head lowered and her body tense as she watched the scene unfold. Greg worked methodically, drawing on the knowledge he had accumulated over the years. He dipped a cloth into a stream nearby, wringing it out and gently dabbing the fawn's forehead, trying to cool its fever. The doe took a cautious step forward, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air, uncertain of the human's presence. Greg paused, holding his breath, and for a moment, the only sound in the clearing was the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. It was a delicate balance. Greg's every move, every decision, felt like it was weighing the fawn's survival on a knife's edge. The doe's watchful eyes never left him, her presence a reminder of the life that was at stake. Greg couldn't afford to fail. He poured a small amount of water into his hand and offered it to the fawn. The tiny creature licked weakly at his fingers, barely responsive but still fighting to hold on. The struggle was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. His arms ached from holding the fawn, and his mind raced with doubts. Was this enough? Was he doing the right thing? Time passed in slow, heavy moments. Greg spoke softly to the fawn, words of encouragement and quiet reassurance. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "You can do this." The doe, sensing the growing tension, stepped closer, her presence an anchor in the storm of uncertainty. She nuzzled the fawn gently, her breath warm against its body. And for a fleeting moment, Greg saw something in her, something that went beyond the animal instinct. It was the bond between a mother and her child, the primal, unyielding drive to protect and nurture. And it was that bond that pushed him to keep going, to fight alongside the doe and her fawn. The struggle was far from over, but in that moment, Greg knew he couldn't stop now. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, but Greg barely noticed. His entire focus was on the fawn, whose breathing had grown even more shallow and labored. The small creature, once trembling weakly in his arms, now seemed to be slipping further away, its body limp and unresponsive. Greg's hands were trembling as he checked the fawn again, pressing his fingers gently to its chest. Its heartbeat was faint, erratic. Time was running out. The doe stood a few paces away, her eyes wide, filled with a mix of desperation and trust. Greg could feel her watching him, silently pleading with him to do something to save her baby. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like 1,000 pounds. In the forest, survival was never guaranteed, but Greg had seen enough to know that there were times when a small window of opportunity could make all the difference. And this, he knew, was one of those times. His thoughts raced as he tried to calculate his next move. Should he try to move the fawn to a safer spot, or was it too late? The signs of dehydration were clear. Its body was growing cold, its limbs stiff. But the fawn was still alive, and as long as there was breath, there was hope. Greg took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He glanced at the doe again. She was close now, standing just a few feet from the fawn, her face filled with an intense, quiet focus. She had not moved from her spot all evening, unwilling to leave her baby's side. She had placed all her trust in him. and Greg could feel the weight of that trust as he held the fawn in his arms. He spoke softly to the fawn, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "Come on, little one, you're stronger than this. Don't give up." The fawn's chest rose and fell with a final shallow breath, and Greg's heart skipped a beat. It was a moment of truth. The fawn was at death's door, and the next few seconds could decide its fate. Greg's hands were slick with sweat as he cradled the fawn, trying to keep it as warm as possible. He pulled the fawn close to his chest, pressing its fragile body against him, desperate for any sign of life. He felt its heartbeat, weak but steady, a tiny thrum that gave him a flicker of hope. He glanced at the doe one last time, and for the first time since he had found them, he saw something in her eyes that made him pause. It wasn't just fear, it was an understanding, a recognition that the battle wasn't over. The doe was still standing, still fighting, and so Greg would keep fighting too. The fawn gave another weak breath, and then, just when Greg thought all was lost, something shifted. The tiniest movement of flutter of its eyelids sent a rush of relief through his body. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The fawn was still in this fight. Greg took another breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle wasn't won yet, but there was hope now. And for the first time since he had found the doe and her fawn, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet, powerful belief that maybe, just maybe, they would all make it through this. Greg's hands were trembling, but his focus had never been sharper. He could feel the fawn's tiny breaths against his chest, and the warmth that was slowly returning to its body, though its condition remained critical. The doe stood beside them, her head low and eyes watchful, sensing the change in the fawn. But as the minutes passed, it became clear to Greg that he couldn't do this alone. He was only one man, and though he had tried everything, the fawn's survival hung by the thinnest of threads. His arms ached, his mind was weary, and the weight of the responsibility was beginning to wear on him. That's when he heard it. A rustling sound, faint at first, but growing louder. Greg's heart skipped a beat. Was it another animal? Or was it something worse, another threat to the fragile creatures he was trying to save? Then, through the trees, emerged a figure. A man, rugged and weathered, with the unmistakable gear of a wildlife expert. Greg blinked, momentarily stunned by the sudden appearance. It was Ethan Carter, a local emergency responder who had been a colleague of Greg's in the past. They'd worked together on several wildlife rescue operations, but Greg had never expected him to be here today. Ethan's eyes scanned the scene in a heartbeat, his gaze flicking from Greg to the doe and the fawn. He didn't waste a word. He moved quickly, instinctively, pulling a first aid kit from his bag and kneeling beside Greg. "Looks like you've got a tough one here," Ethan said, his voice low but calm. "I can help." Relief flooded through Greg, so intense it almost knocked the breath out of him. He had been on the edge, and now, with Ethan's unexpected help, the possibility of saving the fawn seemed within reach once again. Ethan worked with practiced efficiency, applying a cool compress to the fawn's body and administering fluids. Greg, for the first time in hours, felt his body relax slightly. With Ethan's experience, they could do more than just hope. They could act together. The doe, still standing beside them, let out a soft, almost inaudible sound, her eyes never leaving the fawn. She, too, sensed the shift in the air, the help that had come just in time. Greg exchanged a look with Ethan. Without words, they both knew the truth. The fawn's chances had just improved dramatically. The next few days felt like a blur to Greg, a whirlwind of constant care and tension that neither time nor fatigue could ease. The fawn's condition had improved significantly under Greg and Ethan's combined efforts, but it was far from out of the woods. The small creature still had a long road ahead, and Greg knew better than to allow himself to relax too soon. The fawn had regained a slight spark of life, its eyes brighter, its tiny body more responsive. But it wasn't just physical healing that was needed, it was emotional too. Greg knew that the trauma it had endured would take time to recover from, and the bond between the doe and her fawn, fragile as it was, needed to be nurtured as much as the fawn's body. The first morning after Ethan's arrival, Greg found himself kneeling by the fawn's side, his fingers brushing through its soft, damp fur as it slept. The doe stood a few feet away, her eyes never leaving her baby, her vigil constant. Her own injury was healing, but it was clear that her attention was focused entirely on the fawn, her every movement centered around its welfare. Greg had become accustomed to the doe's presence, to the quiet strength she exhibited despite the pain she had endured. There was something remarkable about her. She was a mother, and the world of pain and fear that had once seemed so alien to Greg now seemed a little clearer, a little more intimate. In the short days since their encounter, he had learned more about the silent, unspoken bond between the two creatures than he ever thought possible. It was a bond that transcended words, transcended species. A bond of survival, of love, of an instinct that drove both of them to fight for each other in ways Greg could only begin to understand. He watched as the doe moved closer to her fawn, bending her head to nuzzle the little one's body. Her soft breath was steady against the fawn's fur, and for a moment, Greg saw Ida shift in the air, a sense of connection. The fawn, despite everything it had endured, responded to the doe's touch. Its tiny body moved slightly, as if reassuring her that it was still there, still fighting. Greg stood, a gentle smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of quiet satisfaction. He had done what he could. Ethan had helped when Greg couldn't. And now the fawn was slowly returning to life. But even as he stood, Greg couldn't shake the weight in his chest. The struggle wasn't over. It wasn't just about saving the fawn, it was about something deeper, something that resonated in his soul. He had come to understand that this experience had changed him. He'd seen the raw strength of the doe, the fierce, unwavering love that had kept her moving forward even when all seemed lost. He had witnessed the quiet trust she had placed in him. And now he realized that his own journey, his own understanding of nature was evolving in ways he couldn't yet fully articulate. In the days that followed, Greg and Ethan worked tirelessly. The fawn's strength continued to grow, though the process was slow and painstaking. Each step forward, each sign of improvement, was met with a cautious optimism. Greg had learned that healing was never a linear process. There were setbacks, moments when it felt like the fawn might not make it after all. But then, there were the moments of progress, small signs, that told Greg the fawn was stronger than he had initially thought. The doe, too, was recovering, though her body moved slower than before. Her injury, while still tender, no longer kept her from walking, and she began to graze again, though always within sight of her fawn. She had trusted Greg to help, but she would never leave her baby's side, not until the fawn was ready. And so, day by day, the bond between the three of them deepened. Greg found himself looking at the doe and the fawn with a sense of reverence, understanding now, more than ever, what it meant to be a part of something bigger than oneself. In the quiet moments of reflection, Greg knew he would never forget this experience. The struggle to save the fawn, to heal the doe, had been harder than he had ever imagined. But in the end, it was a lesson in resilience, in love, in the quiet strength of nature which never gave up, even when the odds seemed impossible.